When you hear the name Sparta, the image comes easily. Crimson cloaks billowing in mountain wind, muscles carved from marble, spears flashing like lightning as a lone king roars. This is Sparta. It is a vision that Hollywood has burned into the modern mind, clean, heroic, and unbreakable. Yet behind that crimson veil lies something more difficult to look at, a civilization that found its greatness not in freedom, but in fear. The real Sparta did not live in the slow-motion rhythm of battle scenes. Its people did not sculpt their abs for camera light. They sculpted their hearts into iron, their children into weapons, and their laws into chains. They built a city that worshipped order more than beauty, endurance more than happiness, and the state above the soul. To understand the Spartans, you must forget what you know about ancient Greece. Forget Athens, where marble temples shimmered in the sun and philosophers debated under olive trees. Forget Corinth, where traders and artists brought color to every street. Sparta was none of these things. It stood apart, silent, austere, and watching. Nestled deep within the rugged land of Laconia, Sparta began as a cluster of villages along the Helots River. The valley was encircled by mountains, protected on three sides, open only to the sea. It was fertile enough to feed its people, isolated enough to keep them safe, and confined enough to make every inch of ground feel precious. Geography, more than genius, carved Sparta's destiny. From the very beginning, survival in this valley meant unity. It meant that the tribe had to move as one body, breathe as one lung, and think as one mind. The wild hills taught them that weakness was fatal, and that endurance was the only prayer worth saying. Out of this soil grew a people who would later call themselves Lacedaemonians, sons of the mountain and of Heracles himself. For the Spartans, myth was not storytelling. It was biography. They believed that their kings carried the blood of Heracles, the strongest of all Greek heroes, a demigod whose life was one long act of obedience to divine command. To trace your lineage to him was to inherit both strength and burden. It also justified power. Two royal houses, the Agiads and the Eurypontids, claimed descent from the same divine ancestor. Two kings would therefore rule together, mirroring the twin brothers of myth, Castor and Pollux, whom the Spartans worshipped as protectors of warriors. In this belief lay the seeds of everything that would define Sparta. They were not simply men. They were instruments of heaven, soldiers chosen by Apollo and tempered by Ares. Their laws, their customs, their wars, all were sanctified. And those who resisted Sparta's will did not just defy men. They defied the order of the gods. That order was inscribed, according to legend, in the great red tray, a constitution delivered not by any mortal lawgiver, but by the oracle of Apollo at Delphi. The story tells of Lycurgus, the shadowy founder of Sparta, journeying to the temple to ask how his city should be governed. The oracle's answer was divine minimalism, obedience, discipline, and balance. A government ruled by two kings, advised by elders, restrained by law, and watched by the gods. Whether or not Lycurgus ever lived does not matter. What matters is that the Spartans believed he had, and that Apollo himself had spoken through him. To live in Sparta was therefore to live under a constant sacred gaze. Religion did not soften the edges of life, it sharpened them. Apollo watched through sunlight and prophecy. Artemis watched through blood and endurance. The state became an altar upon which every life was a small offering. Even birth was not a private miracle, but a civic event. Newborns were inspected by elders, and those judged too weak were left to die on the slopes of Mount Taygetus. It was not cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was belief that the purity of the collective must outweigh the tenderness of the individual. The modern world calls this barbaric. The Spartans called it justice. Their entire identity coalesced around one silent conviction, that weakness was treason. To be Spartan was to be strong, or not to be at all. And so their strength became both their pride and their prison. They did not build great monuments or libraries. Their glory was not meant to last in stone or words. It lived instead in the bodies of men trained to die well. "Come back with your shield," the mothers would later say, or on it. That was not poetry. It was the daily creed of an empire of fear disguised as virtue. Yet even in its earliest days, Sparta carried within it a contradiction that would haunt it forever. Its citizens were free because others were not. While Athens grew rich on trade and philosophy, Sparta grew powerful by conquest and by ensuring that its warriors never had to labor for their bread. Somewhere beyond the ridges of the Taygetus Mountains, a shadow already stirred, the people who would become the Helots, the enslaved backbone of Spartan prosperity. But that is a later chapter. For now, the city was still becoming, still drawing its boundaries between the divine and the human. The red cloak that would one day terrify enemies had not yet been dyed. The phalanx had not yet marched, but the idea of Sparta, the dream of a nation where every man's life was a single note in a divine symphony, had already taken shape. It is tempting to romanticize such unity, to see in it the promise of perfect order. But order demands sacrifice. To make men move as one, you must silence the individual heartbeat. To forge a perfect weapon, you must first melt away the soul. By the time the rest of Greece began to see Sparta as different, that transformation was already complete. They dressed alike, ate alike, thought alike. They spoke in the short, sharp sentences that would give birth to the word laconic. To outsiders, they seemed almost inhuman. A people who had chosen discipline over desire, silence over song, and fear over freedom. And yet, there was a kind of beauty in their austerity, a terrible symmetry. They lived as though every dawn might bring war, and every night might be their last. Their children played with wooden spears. Their prayers were training drills. Their festivals were endurance trials. Even their gods seemed harder, less forgiving, shaped in their own image. This was not madness. It was method. The red cloak, the bronze shield, the cold stare, all of it was the visible armor of an invisible faith. That Sparta was eternal because its people could be made unbreakable. But eternity is a fragile dream. The same mountains that protected them also trapped them. The same discipline that gave them unity would one day make them brittle. For a society built entirely on fear must keep fearing something or collapse into itself. And so, as the morning sun rises over the Eurotas Valley, you can almost hear it, the first heartbeat of an empire that will both terrify and fascinate the world for millennia. A place where red cloaks will flutter like blood in the wind, and where the line between faith and fanaticism will blur until they are one. Because before Sparta became legend, it was already a warning. Long before the crimson cloaks, before the roar of "This is Sparta," there was only the hush of the Eurotas Valley, a narrow ribbon of green, cradled by mountains like a secret cupped in the palm of the gods. Mist rolled down from Taygetus at dawn, and the river whispered through olive groves that shimmered under the southern sun. This was Laconia, isolated, fertile, defensible, a geography that seemed carved for destiny. From these quiet beginnings, the myth of Sparta would grow, and like all myths, it would begin not with fact, but with faith. The people who settled this land called themselves Dorians, wanderers from the north who came after the fall of the Bronze Age palaces. To the later Greeks, they were conquerors. To themselves, they were restorers, reclaiming a birthright promised by the gods. In the center of this new world stood two thrones. The Spartans did not believe in one king. They believed in balance. A pair of rulers descended, so they said, from Heracles himself. His blood ran in their veins. His labors echoed in their duties. They were brothers in myth, but rivals in power. The Agiads and the Eurypontids, two dynasties born from a single divine ancestor. One might lead the army to war while the other remained to guard the city, but neither could rule alone. It was as if Sparta had learned from its mountains. Stability comes from symmetry. To those outside the valley, this dual kingship seemed absurd. To those within, it was sacred geometry, a reflection of the divine twins, Castor and Pollux, the Dioscuri, who were believed to guard warriors in battle. When Spartan soldiers marched into war, they invoked the brothers' protection. When thunder cracked over Tagetas, they whispered that it was the Dioscuri sparring above the clouds. The Spartans saw their city not as a place, but as a covenant. They were the chosen children of Apollo, the god of light and law. Their oracle at Delphi spoke to them as though to an heir, and from that sacred voice came the great Rhetra, the constitution that shaped their world. According to legend, it was delivered to the lawgiver Lycurgus, a man or perhaps a myth who traveled north to Delphi and returned bearing divine instruction. Build your city without walls. Apollo was said to command, make your people the wall instead. And so they did. Stone was not their defense, flesh was. Where Athens trusted marble, Sparta trusted discipline. The great Rhetra ordered them to form a council of elders, a gathering of free men, and to live under laws that balanced monarchy, oligarchy, and common assembly. No single ruler would ever hold total power. The gods themselves had split that privilege, and mortals were expected to honor their design. This divine endorsement gave Sparta a terrible confidence. It believed its system to be perfect because it had been born in the mouth of a god. While other Greek cities debated new laws and reforms, Sparta clung to its Rhetra as if to scripture. Innovation was danger. Tradition was armor. Change was a foreign word. The result was a society that saw itself as separate from the rest of Greece. The Athenians painted and argued. The Corinthians traded. The Thebans built temples, but the Spartans built themselves. They saw luxury as infection, individuality as rebellion. Their young were raised to honor the collective, to move in rhythm with their city as the heartbeat moves with the body. Even their worship reflected this rhythm. Theirs was not the gentle piety of philosophers, but a religion of endurance. In their temples, offerings were not only wine and incense, but pain and silence. The goddess Artemis Orthia, protector of youth and punishment, was one of their most revered deities. At her altar, young boys were whipped until blood stained the stone, an offering of flesh to prove obedience and strength. Outsiders recoiled in horror, but for Spartans, pain was prayer, the purest proof of devotion. It is said that during one festival, a boy hid a fox under his cloak to avoid being caught stealing it. When the animal began to claw and bite through his ribs, he remained silent, bleeding to death rather than betray his secret. The story may be myth, but in it lies the essence of the Spartan soul. Better to die with discipline than live with disgrace. And yet, this sanctified cruelty had a purpose. The Spartans believed that through suffering they could transcend fear. By enduring pain, they became untouchable. In the agōgē, the brutal state-run training that would later define Spartan education, this philosophy would be made flesh. But even before the agōgē, the mindset was already forming. Survival is not a right, but a duty. Comfort is a test one must refuse. The great rhetoric ensured that all this hardship was justified by the gods. Its laws declared that wealth corrupts, that gold and silver must be banished, that iron should be the only currency. Not because it was practical, but because it was symbolic. Iron was strength, unyielding, heavy, common. A man who could carry his fortune in gold might lose it in temptation. A man who carried it in iron could barely lift it, and so was safe. It is here, in this paradoxical logic, that Sparta's uniqueness gleamed like a blade in sunlight. The rest of Greece sought happiness, Sparta sought purity. Where others built empires of marble, Sparta built an empire of flesh. Its people were its temples, their endurance, its prayer. But purity is never innocent. To maintain it, Sparta would soon need something darker. A population to labor beneath it, to grow its crops, to build its food, to die in its place. Because even divine soldiers must eat, and warriors who fight every day cannot till the soil. And so the valley, once silent, began to look outward. Beyond Taygetus lay Messene, a land rich in grain and water. Its fields shimmered like a promise, and Sparta was ready to claim it. In the shadow of their gods, they began to march. Their spears glinted in the sun, their cloaks dark as blood. Every step echoed like a prayer to Apollo, a promise to make the world match their faith. They were still few, still untested, but already certain that they were chosen. The mountains watched in silence as the Spartans left their valley for the first time. Behind them lay the cradle of divine law. Ahead, the first conquest that would define their destiny. The gods had given them a valley. Now they would take a kingdom. And in that taking, the line between sacred purpose and ruthless domination would blur forever. The conquest of Messene was not written as a single war. It was carved across decades to brutal conflicts, waged by a people who believed they were carrying out the will of Apollo himself. The Spartans looked west across the Taygetus mountains and saw not a neighboring land, but a divine inheritance waiting to be claimed. Messene was fertile, rich with rivers and wheat fields that rippled like cloth under the wind. To the farmers of Laconia, who lived on thinner soil, it was paradise. To the Spartan kings, it was necessity. When their spears crossed the border, it was not as invaders, but as priests of conquest. The mountains trembled with the sound of bronze and marching feet, and soon the Messenians fell beneath that rhythm. When the fighting ended, the Spartans had doubled their territory, but the victory was more than land. They had acquired a living foundation for their way of life. Those conquered became Helots, an enslaved people bound not to masters, but to soil. Entire families, entire villages, were branded not by iron, but by law. A Helot could not be sold or freed at will. He belonged to the land itself, and the land belonged to Sparta. Every harvest, they gave half their crops to their Spartan overlords. Their sweat fed the warriors who never farmed, and their fear fed the system that kept them silent. To the Spartans, this was not exploitation. It was order, ordained, as they claimed, by Apollo at Delphi. The gods had placed each being in its rightful station, the rulers to command, the Helots to obey. In that divine hierarchy, mercy was disorder, rebellion was sacrilege, but even gods cannot silence terror. The Helots outnumbered their masters by as much as 7-1. To the rest of Greece, this imbalance seemed suicidal. To the Spartans, It was an opportunity to perfect control. They built a state upon vigilance, a perpetual watchtower over the enslaved. Every year, the 5 ephors, the magistrates who oversaw the city, performed a chilling ritual. They declared war on the Helots, not metaphorically, not in ceremony, but as legal truth. From that moment, any Spartan could kill a Helot without fear of religious stain or blood guilt, and they did. In the shadows of the countryside, bands of young Spartans, still in training, still half boys, were sent on secret missions known as the Cryptia. Their task was not battle, but terror. At night they would descend upon the farms, striking down any Helot who appeared too bold, too capable, too alive. It was a lesson carved in blood. Obedience was survival. Rebellion was death. The Spartans called this preservation. The Helots called it horror. Yet such cruelty, to the Spartan mind, was necessity, the iron chain that bound strength to survival. Because beneath their confidence, the Spartans were haunted by the knowledge that their greatness rested on the shoulders of slaves. Every feast, every drill, every boy's education was bought with another man's fear. So they turned that fear into ritual, and that ritual into faith. They taught themselves that cruelty was sacred, because mercy might one day destroy them. Still, even this architecture of dominance could not stand without reinforcement. And that reinforcement would come not from conquest, but from education, a word that in Sparta meant something entirely different. At the age of 7, Spartan boys were taken from their mothers and delivered into the agōgē, the state-run crucible that would strip away childhood and forge warriors from the residue. From that moment on, a Spartan child belonged not to his family, but to his city. He slept in barracks on mats of reeds. He wore a single rough cloak through every season, learned to endure cold and hunger, and ate meager rations designed to leave him wanting. But hunger was a teacher. It taught cunning. Boys were encouraged to steal food to survive, not as rebellion, but as training. If caught, they were punished, not for theft, but for failure. The lesson was as clear as it was cruel. Suffering builds awareness, and weakness invites pain. There is a story told by Plutarch, the philosopher and biographer, who centuries later tried to understand this strange people. A boy, he says, once hid a fox under his cloak, intending to steal it as food. When soldiers approached, the fox turned wild, clawing and biting into his stomach. Yet the boy said nothing. He stood straight, his face pale, until the animal tore through his belly and he fell dead. To the Spartans, this was not tragedy. It was triumph proof that silence and obedience mattered more than life itself. From dawn until dusk, the agōgē drilled into them the geometry of survival. Running, wrestling, spear combat, shield formations, each motion repeated until instinct replaced thought. Their shields were more sacred than their swords, for a shield protected not the self, but the man beside you. To drop it was to betray the line, and betrayal was unforgivable. They learned to endure not only pain, but ridicule. They were mocked, tested, starved, beaten, and praised in equal measure. Songs were few, laughter rarer still. Their diet was a dark broth, pig's blood, vinegar, and salt, so revolting that visiting Athenians joked, "Now I understand why Spartans are so fearless in battle. Death must be better than dinner." But even this had its ritual logic. Every detail of life, food, speech, motion was designed to erode the self until nothing remained but duty. The agōgē was not training, it was transformation. At 20, a Spartan was no longer a man but an extension of the phalanx, the unbreakable wall of shields that defined their warfare. Individual glory was meaningless. only formation mattered. The agōgē created not free men, but instruments, weapons sharpened by the state, wielded by the gods. This transformation did not stop with the men. The women of Sparta, too, were shaped by this creed, though in a different mold. While Athenian women lived behind walls, veiled and silent, Spartan women trained in the open. They ran, wrestled, and threw the javelin. Their bodies were not ornamental but sacred, vessels through which the next generation of warriors would be born. Only strong mothers, the elders said, can bear strong sons, and so the same hardness that defined their husbands defined them. Spartan women owned land, managed estates, and spoke with a confidence that scandalized the rest of Greece. When a foreign woman once asked a Spartan why they alone commanded their men, she replied, "Because we are the only women who give birth to men." From these paradoxes, brutality and balance, tyranny and faith, the myth of Spartan strength was forged. A city-state that believed obedience was virtue, pain was purification, and fear was holy. Yet within this perfection lurked a seed of decay. A people who live by fear must always feed it. A society that worships strength must forever prove it. And somewhere in the night, beyond the flicker of the barracks' fire, the Helots still whispered of rebellion. The mountains that once protected Sparta were now its prison walls, echoing with the one truth no Spartan dared to speak. If the enslaved ever rose, the gods themselves might not save their masters. At dawn, when the mist still clings to the ridges of Taygetus, the sound of bronze greets the morning. The Spartans march not to drums, but to flutes, their rhythm calm, deliberate, almost gentle. To the outsider, it is unnerving, men moving to music, not rage. But this too is their weapon. They have learned that fury burns out, discipline endures. Each soldier stands shoulder to shoulder, his aspis, the great round shield, pressed against the next. Each step, each breath, each heartbeat falls into the same measured cadence. Individually, they are men. Together, they are a single machine of flesh and metal. The phalanx, Sparta's living wall. The Greeks called it a formation. The Spartans called it faith, because to break rank was not simply to fail, it was to blaspheme. Every boy trained in the agōgē grew into this moment. From the age of 7, he learned that the shield was sacred, not because it protected him, but because it protected the man beside him. To drop it meant not just cowardice, but the betrayal of the entire city. "Come back with your shield," mothers would tell their sons. Or on it, it was not a metaphor. A fallen warrior's body was carried home on that very piece of bronze. When they advanced, they did so in silence. No chants, no screams, only the whisper of sandals against dust, the low hum of flute song keeping their pace. Their enemies, used to shouting and chaos, found this quiet unbearable. It was as though the gods themselves were marching. To fight against a Spartan phalanx was to fight against inevitability. Their red cloaks flashed like fire in sunlight, their polished helmets reflected the sky. The lambda, the Greek letter for Laconia, gleamed on their shields. A reminder that they were not individuals, but fragments of one symbol. Before battle, they braided their long hair, a gesture the poet Xenophon once called the calm before sacrifice. To the Spartans, beauty in death was as important as victory in life. Their kings, too, fought among them. Unlike the distant rulers of other cities, a Spartan king stood in the front line, his spear aimed forward. He was not merely sovereign, but the first offering to Ares. Each campaign began with sacrifice, an animal, Blood spilled on the ground to test the favor of the gods. Only if the entrails read well would the army march. In this, faith and war were never separate. Their victories were many, but their legend was sealed in one place, Thermopylae, the hot gates. It was the year when Persia, vast and relentless, came west. King Xerxes crossed the Hellespont with an army that Herodotus claimed numbered 1,000,000, though modern minds temper that to hundreds of thousands. Yet numbers mattered little to myth. Against this tide of empire, Greece seemed a collection of quarrelsome villages, and at their head stood the smallest of them all, Sparta. But even Spartans bowed to their gods. When the Persian threat loomed, Sparta was bound by the Carnia, a festival sacred to Apollo, during which no military campaign could be launched. The law of the god was iron. No army could march until the festival ended. Still, the call for help from northern Greece could not be ignored. So they did what Spartans always did. They found a middle path between obedience and defiance. King Leonidas, descendant of Heracles, gathered a personal guard of 300 warriors, each a father, so that their bloodlines would endure even if they did not. Alongside a few thousand allies, they marched north to hold the narrow pass of Thermopylae, where mountains met the sea. There, in a corridor of rock and salt air, they made their stand. For 2 days, the Persians hurled themselves against the phalanx. Wave after wave broke upon the bronze wall. Immortals, archers, cavalry, all falling before the unyielding rhythm of the Spartans' advance and retreat. Herodotus wrote that they fought as if each man were a god in disguise. The Greeks mocked their foes, even in the midst of battle. When told that Persian arrows would blot out the sun, one Spartan replied, "Then we shall fight in the shade." But destiny, like the mountains, cannot be held forever. A local named Ephialtes revealed to Xerxes a hidden path through the hills, allowing the Persians to flank the defenders. Leonidas, learning of the betrayal, dismissed most of his allies. Only the Spartans and 700 Thespians who refused to leave remained. They knew what awaited them. And still, they combed their hair, straightened their cloaks, and prepared to die beautifully. The third day began in thunder. Surrounded, the Spartans fought until their spears splintered, then drew their swords, then their hands. Leonidas fell, and the battle became a ritual of defiance. The Persians, enraged, took his body and crucified it, yet in doing so, they made him immortal. For in death, Sparta had found its sermon. The hot gates fell, but their sacrifice burned itself into the memory of Greece. The oracle at Delphi had foretold it. Either a Spartan king would die, or the city would fall. Leonidas chose the first fate, and by dying, saved the second. Within a year, the Persians were driven back, first at Salamis, then at Plataea, but it was Thermopylae that endured. It was not victory that made Sparta eternal. It was the art of losing so well that loss became holiness. From that moment, Sparta was no longer just a city. It was an idea that perfection required obedience, that freedom was earned only through sacrifice, that fear could be mastered if one learned to worship it. Their red cloaks, once the color of blood, became the color of myth. The wall of bronze had fallen, but in the echo of their silence, Greece heard something divine. For men may forget the names of kings and battles, but they never forget the sound of courage that does not need to shout. When the dust of Persia's armies finally settled over the Aegean, Sparta stood taller than any city in Greece. Their warriors had become symbols of salvation, their dead transformed into saints of discipline. The crimson cloak was now more than uniform. It was relic. Greece owed its survival to men who had chosen death over retreat. Yet, as history always whispers, what is worshipped soon begins to decay. The years after Thermopylae brought Sparta not peace, but temptation. Having proved itself the shield of Helots, it began to wield that reputation like a weapon. The rest of Greece, especially Athens, rebuilt in marble and ambition. Where Sparta embodied austerity and obedience, Athens bloomed with freedom and art. Two worlds, two visions of what it meant to be human, now faced each other across the Aegean, one ruled by the mind, the other by the spear. Athens saw itself as the soul of civilization. Merchants, poets, philosophers, and architects weaving a city of thought. Sparta saw that same energy as corruption, an empire of softness wrapped in gold. Each despised what the other adored. To the Athenians, the Spartans were fanatics. To the Spartans, the Athenians were decadent. Their rivalry was inevitable, not born of greed, but of philosophy. When the Peloponnesian War erupted in 431 BCE, it was not merely a conflict of cities, but of ideas. The sea-bound empire of Athens met the landlocked rigor of Sparta, democracy against discipline. The war lasted nearly 30 years, a slow grind of sieges, betrayals, and starvation. For every Athenian tragedy written on a stage, there was a Spartan silence carved into the battlefield. And in the end, silence triumphed. In 404 BCE, the proud walls of Athens fell. Its fleet was sunk, its empire scattered. Spartan soldiers, men raised on the black broth and the agōgē cruelty, marched into the city of Athena. The long walls that once joined Athens to its harbor were torn down to the sound of Spartan flutes. It was a symbolic act. The goddess of wisdom bowed before the god of war. For the first time in history, Sparta ruled all of Greece. The dream was complete. Yet what the gods grant, they often grant as a curse. The discipline that had once been their strength began to hollow into arrogance. Sparta installed puppet governments, the 30 tyrants in Athens and oligarchic councils elsewhere, claiming to bring order but delivering oppression. Allies became subjects, admiration turned to fear, and for a people who believed themselves chosen by Apollo, it was easy to confuse conquest with destiny. But destiny is jealous. It demands payment. The cracks began where Sparta was strongest, within its own walls. For generations, the number of true Spartan citizens, the Spartiates, had been shrinking. Only those born of two Spartan parents and able to contribute to the communal mess halls were counted among the elite. Wealth had been outlawed in name, yet victory had brought spoils from Persia, tribute from allies, and temptation in every form. Iron currency could not keep out gold forever. The rich grew richer, the poor fell from citizenship. The army of equals became an army of exceptions. As numbers dwindled, the phalanx grew thinner. The wall of bronze that had once seemed eternal began to fray at its edges. Still, Sparta clung to its rituals, the flutes, the silence, the perfection, as though ceremony could replace substance. Then, in 371 BCE, the illusion shattered at a place called Leuctra. Facing the Thebans under the brilliant general Epaminondas, the Spartans met an army that had studied their every move. The Thebans broke tradition, massing their best troops 50 men deep on the left wing, aimed directly at the Spartan elite. The wall of bronze met a spear of iron. When the two collided, Sparta's right flank buckled. Its king fell, and with him the myth of invincibility died. The defeat sent tremors through all of Greece. Cities that had once bowed in obedience now raised their heads. The Thebans marched into the Peloponnese and did what none had dared before. They liberated Messenia, freeing the Helots who had toiled under Spartan rule for centuries. The foundation of Sparta's power, the labor of others, crumbled overnight. Some said it was divine punishment, the gods finally reclaiming the blood debt owed since the days of conquest. For the first time, Sparta faced a world without slaves to sustain it, without allies to fear it, and without faith to justify its suffering. Its greatness had been built on discipline, but its survival had depended on oppression. Once that chain broke, so did the city. By the time Rome rose from its own hills, Sparta was a relic, a name whispered with reverence and pity. The warriors who had once terrified empires, now trained for tourists. At the temple of Artemis Orthia, young men were still whipped before the altar, but no longer for faith or courage. Now it was spectacle, a performance staged for foreign eyes. The Romans, enthralled by the myth of lost virtue, watched in fascination as the blood ran down their backs. They called it tradition. The Spartans called it survival. And so, the city that had once refused luxury now sold its own legend. The agōgē became theatre, the rhetra became story. The gods, once worshipped in silence, were now invoked in reenactment. The discipline remained, but hollow, an echo in an empty shrine. Yet paradoxically, in this decay, Sparta found a second immortality. The Romans saw in them what they longed to see in themselves: courage without question, obedience without flaw, sacrifice without end. To the philosophers of later ages, Sparta became a mirror, reflecting the purity they imagined had been lost to time. And so, long after the phalanx rusted away, the legend endured. The red cloak fluttered across centuries, from scrolls to sculptures, from stories to cinema. Each retelling polished the iron a little brighter, forgetting the blood that first stained it. Sparta became the symbol of unbreakable will, the city that conquered death by worshipping it. But listen closely beneath the roar of history, and another sound emerges, the quiet truth that the Spartans themselves could never silence. The truth that power built on fear must always feed that fear, and that every wall of bronze eventually rusts from within. Sparta's mountains still stand, the Eurotas still flows, yet the city they once protected has long since faded into dust. What remains is the story, severe, beautiful, and terrible, a story that warns as much as it inspires. Because in the end, the Spartans achieved what they desired most. They became eternal. But eternity, like obedience, has a cost. Sparta died long ago, but as long as men dream of courage without compassion and order without mercy, the crimson cloak will never stop fluttering in the wind. The wall has fallen. The legend remains.